Okay, I decided I wanted to rehash one of the issues. I guess I know that there's a certain sort of controversial, skeptical element that is too easy to introduce into this question, but I'm just going to go back into the issue of exploitation. Uh, so essentially, if you define class and exploitation both in relation to the means of production, um, yeah, I guess the main thing that I want to drive at, and it is a complicated issue to sort of open, and there are probably much easier ways of formulating the sort of the technical criticism of this. But for example, the professor sort of suggests that let me take this from. I've forgotten my thread of when I was thinking about this. I mean, basically, I think that it's a bit embarrassing to make the argument that it's vague and embarrassing. It is specifically vague to suggest that. I can't remember how he formulated it, but he was basically suggesting that that exploitation in terms of the means of production, or at least access. Oh yeah, exploitation in terms of ownership of the means of production. Yeah, I think that there is a neat refutation that can be mounted against suggesting that is such a vital, is sort of objectively of a kind of vital importance. I think it is almost on a technical level, it's arbitrary, which is why I later get into calling it, the politics of appearances. How do things appear in relation to the means of production? Because what does it matter if you own the means of production, if you still command the means of production, if you still effectively control the means of production? So ownership and control are not clearly distinct in the capitalistic system. And in as much as the capitalist is aggregating the surplus value from the workers, what's to say that their accumulation of that surplus value is not repaid back to the workers in another form? Obviously, if you just track the feature of ownership of the means of production, it puts the ownership of the means of production further away from the capacity of the workers. But what does that matter if essentially the demands, the consumeristic demands of the, or at least, I mean, there's nothing actually in the capitalistic system that stops consumers from banding together and creating their own criteria for purchases. Yeah, that perhaps, perhaps unionization on that level would be far more appropriate to sort of ameliorating at least the socialistic complaints against capitalism, because that really compels industry and people who own the means of production in the right sort of in the right vector. It's not at the point at which labor is supplied; it's the point at which consumption essentially is engaged in. Would be the proper channeling of let's say the power of those who at least don't own the means of production but can still quite clearly control it. If they were just able to organize, if they were just able to actually do something rather than just sort of make demands of the ether, and sort of make these sort of vague moralistic sort of claims that they're being persecuted as a group and by another group, or something like that, which is effectively, that is always going to be a reduction. Saying that that's a fact, like, well, what is that fact premised in? It's premised in tautological things like, well, your relation to the means of production, your relation in the your relation to owning the means of production is the groundwork of everything, is the fundamental, is the first precept of anything, which that's not clear at all. That's an abject, puerile, table-thumped, sort of conjecture. Now, describing history in those terms, it does offer some insight. It does offer some, interesting things that you can, some themes that you can, it's a good historical analysis. Again, I come up with this general idea that I came up with a different formulation of basically saying the same thing that I can't remember now. It was quite elegant, that essentially Marxism isn't the prime diagnosis. It's a sort of, it's a symptom in some sense. The Marxist analysis is looking just at one symptom, and how you cure the disease is not by combating the symptom, essentially. And that also even the symptom that it tracks is not objectively the thing to be concerned about. So it's sort of like fumbling towards something. I can't remember my elegant synthesis of how to sort of depict that slightly better, that sort of saves a bit more of how, of its importance or utility. Let me think now. There was another thing. Yeah, so I mean, effectively, discounting the fact that you could say that maybe the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, actually it's better for the proletarian that they have their surplus value, because what would they do with that surplus value, essentially? Would they be able to control the means of production in a better sense? I mean, now this is the sort of the murky area, because you could say, oh, well, objectively they would do things, or they could at least improve their own quality of life and things like that. And I mean, I do think that the state itself, at least in the kind of in the social democratic capitalistic sort of vein, has more than enough tools to sort of ensure a basic standard, to raise the floor, not by pegging it up by like minimum wage, but by providing education and things like that. And perhaps it even sometimes does too much, because then charity itself doesn't actually ever get a if it's the state's job to sort of fill in all the cracks and fix everything, then you get this this very toxic situation where essentially the state can always offset the accountability that it has to actually fix things using the Marxist narrative, essentially, and they can just squander and be ineffective and inefficient, and essentially steal the money or be corrupt or be just useless in such a great sense. And rather than if you actually had almost like a different kind of social contract between the polity itself, that the rich would do some form of charity, which because the government was not so tasked in some sense, and then you could actually blame the market for not inventing some kind of compromise within itself, some kind of charitable collusion between things, in which food is not wasted and given to the poor and such things like that. So that there would be perhaps a greater dynamism and incentive to do that, because and there would also be a clearer moral sort of imperative, because they weren't being taxed effectively. They weren't what's the word? They weren't being taxed in order to supposedly have the government solve those problems. Yeah, okay, so this is the kind of, now I start sounding stupid and talking about these sorts of issues, but the I mean, it comes to the age-old sort of thing. Well, if you don't want certain people to become rich, don't buy things, don't support their businesses, don't support other things, support alternatives. But to the extent to which people don't do that, they don't do that for very particular reasons. They're not being sold things that are priced correctly or that do the same thing. But if they could put up with buying the substandard thing to help it get off the ground and to help it develop its business or something like that, and then that model of production was like a cooperative, you could just say, these products are made by cooperatives, if you believe in class consciousness, let's just displace the bourgeoisie. It's going to be expensive and inefficient in terms of the actual competing of the price, but there's nothing stopping people from doing that in some sense. And so there are lots of different ways in which none of these things are ever done, because essentially the heart of the solution to these things is just a kind of top-down imposition that will sort of always sort of morally scapegoat and exteriorize its failings onto the narrative and the appearance of that narrative and the importance of the appearance of that narrative. And so it's like you have to put up with so much bureaucratic shit and constraint on your freedom of contract, just so that everyone can say, yeah, well, we all kind of indivisibly own the means of production, which I'll say again is not so much different from living in a fascist society and saying, yeah, we all so much indivisibly own a share of the means of cultural production, the means of our ethnic culture or our ethnic auspices and we share in that sort of collective narrative, and everything must be rooted and aligned according to those aspects and features. So I'm losing the plot slightly. So what was the other thing that I was focusing on? Yeah, and there are even historical examples as to why you could say that the workers that have given over their surplus value to the capitalists, well, it is because the capitalists are essentially promoting access to production more effectively. That's how they gain that level of exploitation. I mean, essentially they're exploiting the means of the ownership of the means of production. They're not exploiting anything else. That's the only technical feature to which you could say that they're exploiting. But in order to do that, it's like saying, oh, I'm so powerful, I own the power companies, I own the energy production facility. Like, you have no fucking power if you own an electricity power plant. What, you think that, oh yeah, these people, they wouldn't have power without me, so I'll just switch it off. Yeah, let's see how long that lasts. If you say, well, actually, I own this, so I'll just switch it off, and then you'll realize how much you need me, and I can exploit you. Like, you can't do that. You switch off the power because you choose to do so. You're not powerful. You're dead. You're going to get killed by a mob or something like that. It's not going to last. That power, that imagination of power, doesn't last very long. You have power so much as you continue to deliver to your market, and the only way that you can sort of make that evil is if you say, well, the level of potential disposable income is like being taken away from most people and concentrated in the hands of a few people. But potential disposable income is not the same as like as the pool of actual disposable income that is actually sort of incommercia, which is what prices will actually reflect. And then the only way that they sort of get out of this is they say, well, actually there is some unknown synthesis of how it could all be done better, and therefore capitalism has no justification against this unnamed, indefinite improvement, which like comes in the form of a structured imposition that has to be sort of made by the top down, because it has to be able to sort of flout freedom of contract in just the perfect balance, and that has to sort of come as a package that is more efficient and effective than capitalism. Yeah, so you have this sort of this unknown future, which is, you know, that's vague and embarrassing to sort of compare it to, but yeah, and this the same sort of argument has a different sort of guise, in that it's launched in the form of that. Which is kind of like a sort of an alternative. I'm trying to remember what his sentiment was, because I just remember thinking how embarrassing it was. That it's not useful. What was it? It was something to do with efficiency. I mean, it basically related to this point of inequality, I guess. Inequality in relation to the ownership of the means of production. I just remember thinking also how disparate it was in terms of something to do with features of the state. You know, yeah, damn, I can't remember it now, but it was something to do like with the theme that, you know, sort of the complaint against capitalism is that it's decentralized. And so you, like, hypothetically are going to have a better centralized system that is somehow going to match up with political freedoms and economic freedom, or some level of freedom that exists within certain restrictions that keep the ideological sort of imperative that conserve the sanctity of this new order, or something like that, of this removed evil and this removed source of evil. When essentially all you're removing are, as far as I can see, arbitrary distinctions that don't necessarily manifest. Okay, it had to do with how those features manifested. Essentially, how he suggested that they always manifest, how they necessarily manifest, and his reading of the capitalistic system as well, which sort of doesn't take into account. Yeah, which also somewhat related to an issue that I also wanted to bring up, which is the problem of description and definition. That you can just define class essentially because you claim to be exploited as a group or by a group, and you can just, so like, you have to end up fixing it to this very rigid conception of the ownership of the means of production, and then you've forgotten all the levels of control that existed within the capitalistic system that was essentially decentralized control of the means of production, because people have to be sensitive to their markets, and there's nothing stopping the market from becoming intelligent, from acting as a coherent actor or entity, if it so wishes to actually manifest its power as such. The failure of people to do that, and the idea that somehow under the Marxist banner, political banner, that sort of that problem of alignment and sort of um, delegates, and having, you know, a system of delegation and sort of and a kind of collective bargaining and such. Essentially forces people to only have a valid claim if they can generalize the claim. And this is an arbitrary distinction in legal structures, to say that no, you don't have a claim unless you can show yourself to be part of essentially a class action, to be speaking on behalf of a class, and we're only going to be sensitive to class as is defined by a very particular dogma, which the fascists already, you know, have a kind of a technical argument against, in some sense. So at some point you have to say, no, we're going to look at ownership of means of production, and we don't care about any other classes that manifest within our society. And it is so easy to cook up another set of relations which eventually become a different kind of exploitation, but it's simply hidden between the sort of the bureaucracy. And I mean, you know, the argument against Russia was that you essentially had a coordinator class. And there's no way to get around that idea that you're going to have a coordinator class. You're going to have an intelligentsia that is going to sort of be the hive mind for the collective. The only other way of sort of unproblematizing this sort of issue is if you have a very clear constitution which really in principle has everything laid out, like almost like the Roman law system, but it has very particular features in terms of its politics, and it has a lot of variance that can be done within those broad structures, but it has broad principles. And then you have, you know, systems in which people can change the direction and adapt it within certain hard boundaries that preserve certain things. And even that you wouldn't be able to impose on a state. You would have to have a voluntary buy-in to it. It would have to have people chose to belong to that order or that constitution. You wouldn't be able to impose it from the top down. I mean, one of the biggest problems that Marxist thinking has is that if it doesn't make somewhat of a universal reasoned claim about morality or ethics, that actually works on the scale of the human psyche, which I think it actually doesn't, because it's only talking about sociological entities and a sociological form of analysis. That it becomes a hideous thing as soon as it ever touches the legal structure. You get a kind of formalism, and you get a kind of legal positivism, which is indistinguishable from fascistic bullshit and brittle form of rationalism that essentially is only secured by a kind of executive fiat or the kind of the moral authority of the executive. So essentially, when you vote at the ballot box, you are ceding your moral. You're basically becoming a vassal of the state, of what becomes a kind of state sovereignty or something like that. Or at least into the authoritarian paternalism of what will then be your next executive. And so you get the Napoleonic corruption of law, the Napoleonic form of a hollowed out citizenry, which essentially become just puppets and on the moral strings of their betters, of their political elite. You don't have that vision of the common law. You don't have that vision of that the morality of the individual is the reason of the state, is the universal. You don't have that. Libertarian political philosophy is completely hollowed out, which was preserved in within some form or within the Roman system of law, because you knew what all the rules were, and there were certain things that were not crossed, and if they were crossed, you knew exactly what the consequences were in law, even if they only happened 50 years later or 70 years later. There was no getting away from it. It was really quite brilliant, because it was a kind of a rationalized realness in the universe. They didn't have principles if they couldn't be enforced, and so that they had to have enough good principles that you could actually have a sophisticated society and culture run on. Anyway, sort of made reason tangible, but there was a point now that I've skipped over. And essentially everything just rests then in the alternative, in the alternative conception of the state and sort of corruption of a republic, is that, well, there is no republic essentially. It's just a kind of what is it called? It's admiralty law. It's just the ship has been seized. The vessel has been captured. And been turned into a anyway, okay, I'm getting into admiralty law is not going to be easy to talk about because it's so nuanced. I mean, technically, we actually have a mixed system. We have admiralty, and we also have the other things that are somewhat working in the background, and that combination has actually served us quite well, because many people are just too irresponsible to actually live legally within the republic, so they live within the democracy instead, essentially. But anyway, that is a whole huge can of worms. But where's the point? Is effectively when you go the Napoleonic route, essentially it's, well, continental law I don't even think makes these distinctions. Essentially all there is admiralty. There isn't even an awareness and sensitivity that there are stronger forms of law. It's all just this sort of this man-made project of laws of man. It doesn't, admiralty and or even the notion of the rule of law within continental philosophy and Western Western European political thought is garbage. I mean, you can't really do anything with it. Napoleon just screwed up that continent from a kind of, they destroyed all the Roman law principles essentially. They don't even understand general principles. It's quite a disgusting mentality actually. So when you talk to continental Europeans about politics, it's like staring into the void. It really is scary. That's a generalization, obviously. Anyway, so this rant, I started talking about it because I was talking about how the Marxist analysis at least gives a kind of an abstract ideal that you can base the same form of culture, political culture, around. So, and their thing is the ownership of the means of production, essentially, which then portends to have a kind of historicity, a kind of a historical, factual, sort of built-in pertinence, which, as long as you can believe that is the kind of the ontological totalitarian cornerstone of human civilization. But this is the problem: is that you end up having to rationalize and align everything according to it, and everything only matters to the degree to which it can be associated to some degree with it. And it manifests as a very kind of brittle mind virus, which is why you get pathetic and vague arguments for it that essentially are people whining and complaining that what you're talking about isn't relevant to their narrative, isn't relevant to being part of something that aligns with their tautological, sort of certainty that sort of has a kind of door that tethers onto morality and supposed human concern. So you've got this historical paradigm that gives you access to looking at objects and relations and categorizing knowledge according to it, and then you've just, like, it's exploitation, and exploitation is bad. So, like, that's why we should be concerned with it preeminently. And that seem to be the only two things that you need, essentially, to operate a kind of groupthink as intellectual as they want to dress themselves up in being. And they no longer are interested in tracking the weaknesses of the analysis, the sort of the reductionism in the analysis, the tenuousness of the appearance of the things that they're tracking, the kind of the internal, and how you can get other arrays and systems. I can still on some level call myself a Marxist and be very happy to live in a capitalist society where the default system of property relations is all capitalistic, and you can easily use that legal system in a liberal, democratic, Western capitalistic society. That could be the foundation of a communist utopia. It's just that the communist utopia doesn't operate on the level of the state. And you perhaps, anyway, I'm just going to stop this recording. It's probably too embarrassing to upload.